Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power to the Flower podcast. My name is Nairobi, and I'm the host. And today I am joined with a very special guest, a friend of mine. His name is Andy Vargas, or do you prefer Andres?
Como tú quieras.
Como tú
You can call me
quieras.
dude if you want
Dude.
to. Yeah.
I bet the kids call you that too sometimes. But Andy, you are a state rep over in Haverhill.
Yep.
We're both Hillies.
That's right.
Okay, we're like native Massachusetts kids, lo do dominicano,
Yep.
de lo mío.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I love about you is that you have taken your journey from just being a student who was advocating, all the way in the State House back when we were in high school. Mm-hmm. Okay, teens leading the way.
That's right.
Right.
Shout out UTech.
Right. And then also, you were doing some things with, even way back then, like Just Violence Intervention with VIP and all of those different organizations. But today, you are the head of the Massachusetts Black and Latino Caucus. How do you feel about that position? First of all, welcome and thank you for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I think it's great that you have this platform where folks can get educated on so many different topics, particularly around cannabis. Mm-hmm. I think the more advocacy that we have and more informed people that we have around this issue, which is pretty complex, the better policy we'll create at the State House. So thank you for having this platform and for educating folks. In terms of the Black and Latino Caucus, it's a big responsibility. We're 26 members. We've grown to the largest we've ever been. Wow. It's a caucus that started at one point with just 3 members in the 1970s, and now we're up to 26. So, and you can imagine we're kind of like a family where you grow larger and there's more opinions, there's more priorities, there's more, egos. But at the end of the day, we're one family. Yeah. And the thing that binds us together is that we have issues that affect all of our districts. That allow us to sort of rise above personal politics and egos, and so that we can focus instead on what's best for Black and brown communities in Massachusetts. So I take it seriously. It's a big responsibility, and I'm just honored that my colleagues put their faith in me.
That's dope. One of the things that I always remembered about the Black and Latino Caucus just being so, like, every year you would see there's more faces. So you kind of touched on that. But what has been sort of the driving force, especially with, like, the idea of building a bench to the Black and Latino Caucus, just kind of coalescing and making sure that, more people are involved in civics?
Yeah, I mean, I know each of the members take it upon themselves to, in their districts in particular, figure out, like, who are some good candidates that can run, whether it's for city council, for school committee, so they're ready to potentially run for state rep or state senate once that opportunity becomes available. And that's something that I think is paying dividends with the numbers that we have right now at the State House. But more importantly, one of the big ways to do it is through redistricting. So redistricting happens every 10 years, and it's where we draw the lines of what districts will look like. And in the past, it's been used as a tool to actually exclude people of color from having majority-minority seats. And what we mean by majority-minority is that you have a district where minorities are a majority of the voting age population. And so the last 2 times we did redistricting, we created more than a dozen new majority-minority seats, both in the House and in the Senate, that facilitated the numbers that we have now. Wow. And so it's an intentional policy decision coupled with being intentional individually as members with talking to people in our districts that may be good candidates to come off the bench.
That's dope, because we have a lot of, like, newcomers who are interested in running for office. There's some folks who are, like, ready to retire from office. And this wave, I would say, is due to the fact that politics has just become that much more divisive over the years. And it's crazy.
100%. Right? I always say that, like, getting into politics for most people is an irrational decision. Like, right? Like, to be honest.
Or ego-based.
Right. Like, when you think about it, like, if you make professional decisions based off of, like, how you're going, are you going to get paid? Are you resourced? Are you going to be able to get something done immediately? For most people, the answer is no to all those things, right? So you're under-resourced, you're underpaid, people are attacking you all the time, and you could be making a lot more money and have more peace in another area. Now, the problem with that is that because it's an irrational decision, it attracts a lot of irrational people. And so I always say we need more rational people to make the irrational decision to run for office. Because that's how we start to make a difference.
Well, when you were young, did you feel like you were irrational when you ran for city council? You were the youngest. Kudos to Andy, yo.
Thank you.
Putting people on, doing it at a young age. That was dope. Like, so we went to high school. So I dropped out of school. I don't know if you remember or no, but I dropped out of school at some point in 2011. But we were in high school together at the same time. That was the year that you graduated at Haverhill High. So I left from Lawrence High to Haverhill High School. At that time frame, I remember I was like still interning for Mayor Fiorentini, who was like the mayor at that time. And one of the things that I remember seeing, even just like through the course of everything, the lack of Hispanic representation, not just in politics, pero en la comunidad. O sea, like, there wasn't really a lot of us.
In leadership positions.
No. So when you ran for office, it was a big fucking deal. Sorry for the French, but it was a big deal because we were seeing people who look like us in these spaces who was daring and young enough to run. But I didn't think you were irrational, but maybe in retrospect you're like, that was crazy.
I mean, it was crazy, but it was also like when you're young, you can afford to take those risks, right? So like I had just graduated from Boston University. I moved in back with my parents. We launched a campaign.
Shout out to Orlando,
Shout out to my parents, Orlando and Veronica. And we made the dining room, our little dining room, the campaign headquarters. And so for me, I had the somewhat of an ability to take that risk because I was still living at home. At the end of the day, I could work my other job, not worry too much about rent. Like I was contributing at home, but not a full rent that I would be contributing out and having my own apartment. And so it gave me a little bit of a cushion to be able to focus on the campaign at a young age. And so it was still kind of irrational because you're straight out of Boston University. You can go into a job where you're making 75, 80, 90 grand. And instead I was like, you know what, I'm going to go back home and try to make a difference because, like you said, growing up, you looked around, there weren't many people in leadership positions that looked like us.
Absolutely. What inspired you, though? Because I know you were at the White House, for an internship, and that was cool. And obviously, I think just being down in D.C., you're like motivated by all of the statues around you. De que yo voy a hacer uno de estos días.
No, yo pensaba que yo me iba a quedar para allá in Washington, but that was part of the plan. Whenever you major in political science and international relations, the sort of vibe is like you got to go do DC. You got to go live in DC. You got to have your full-time job there, do a couple years there, pay your dues, blah, blah, blah. And that was the plan. It was kind of working out. Like my second semester senior year, I did an internship at the White House under the Obama administration. And I was going to segue into a full-time job because everyone was leaving the White House to go to the Hillary campaign or the Bernie campaign or other campaigns. And so all these full-time jobs were opening up, and I was able to pick where I wanted to work at the White House, which is amazing.
That's dope.
But ultimately, the president said something to his interns in a kind of a private moment where a lot of us were wrestling with this question, like, what do we do after this, right? Like, we just spent 6 months here, at the White House, a part of this an amazing experience. How do we continue to, like, live fulfilling lives? And the president was responding to a question, and I'm going to do an Obama impersonation. If it's bad, you guys can cut it out. So he said...
I'm not cutting it out for the record.
Well, look, so he goes... look, let me be clear.
Hi, Andy.
He said the key to living a fulfilling life is don't think about who you want to be. Think about what you want to do.
You forgot the thumb.
I know, the thumb. Dramatic pause. And what he meant by that was like, ever since we were, this tall, we were asked, do you want to be a lawyer, a doctor, a congressman, a scientist, a CEO? And these wonderful titles, right? But you were not asked, like, what do you want to do with those titles, right? Are you the scientist that cures cancer? Are you the attorney that fights for working people? Are you the congressman that is going to fight climate change, right? Those are specific actions that you take with those roles. And that instead, nowadays, what we have in Congress is a bunch of people that woke up one day and said, I want to be president, or I want to be a congressman. And they didn't think about why. And so when they get there, it's natural that everything becomes about self-preservation of that title. Because cuando eran chiquitos, they just thought, I want that title. They didn't think about what they wanted to do with the title. And so when they get there, it's all about the title. So I said to myself, well, why do I want to stay in D.C.? Like, why is that motivating me? Why do I want to stay here? And it wasn't really about what I wanted to do, the actions that I wanted to take. It was more about what society was telling me what I should be, right? That I should be a young DC Politico, right? And that wasn't really like vibing with me, right? So I was on social media and I saw that teachers were organizing in Haverhill because they were some of the lowest paid in the state. I saw that a family friend lost their son to the opioid crisis. And then I started to think about why I never thought about coming back home. And that eventually became the reason to come back home. That most young people from gateway cities, from Haverhill, from Lawrence, from Fall River, New Bedford, Holyoke, Springfield, you name it, success is getting out. Right? And if we don't tackle that brain drain, then we're going to end up in this cycle that we continue in these gateway cities of not retaining our talent and scaling our talent and supporting our talent.
Absolutely.
And so that's why I decided to come back home.
That's open. And yes, for the record, brain drain does mean that, to secure talent, people who are brilliant minds, and keeping them in the community. You've done a lot of work with manufacturing stuff, but also just like in general, Haverhill, for example, and I'm just going to like pivot a little bit to cannabis now, but Haverhill is one of the first cities, right, that was willing to take a chance on cannabis. And it's one of the cities that has been, albeit a little bit controversial with some of those lawsuits, but still playing a role in basically what host community agreements are, what the playing field should look like for social equity applicants, todo lo bueno, tú sabes. But being, you know, sort of the pioneer in the Merrimack Valley, aside from like Lowell, we have these major cities, the gateway cities that really could benefit from these opportunities. So cuando yo veo una ciudad así como like we're in Lawrence right now, this is like where I was raised, you know, I see that those opportunities might be missing, but would you say that there are specific beneficial opportunities other than just tax benefits, like to having cannabis as a member of the community or hosting cannabis in the community? Yeah,
I mean, obviously the revenue is really important, right? In terms of having more funding for our schools and, you know, mental health projects and all sorts of things. But the other thing is that we also have more economic activity downtown, right? Like we have more people that come, for example, to STEM, and then after they go to STEM, they go to the Tap or they go to another restaurant in the area. And so it creates that foot traffic that you want in the downtown. And then you also have operators that are invested in the community, right? There are people that donate to Boys and Girls Club, the Ys, the different groups in the city that are making a big difference with our youth. And then honestly, from a public safety perspective, right? I mean, we can all, you know, talk about in our youth, like, young people do some crazy things to access weed. Like if it wasn't, even 18, 21 year olds, right, would do crazy things to access weed, right, out on the streets. And so now there's a secure, safe place to do all that.
With age limits.
And everything in place. And so, I think all of that is a net positive for the community. For
Absolutely. Sure. Absolutely. And I love that because host communities, through a part of this agreement, you know, like they're able to get in sort of like a contractual agreement with the cannabis dispensary, and just basically list out ways that they're going to positively impact the community. So there's something called positive impact plans, or PIPs, as what the cannabis industry calls it. And these are opportunities. I'm like, yo, we could be doing way more with these positive impact plans and finding ways to enforce that. And so maybe creatively we could think about it. But, you know, I definitely love how progressive you are just in your ideology of what cannabis can bring to a city. But also just, you know, you are that much more progressive.
It just what does the most good, right? Like every decision I try to make as a public official is what does the most good, right? And looking at the facts, looking at the data, look at the public health implications, for example, in this case. And then the reality is that, you know, liquor does a lot more harm than even cannabis does, right? But yet we've had a culture of normalizing liquor for a very long time, right? And
Oy se bebe, hello,
right? And that's, you know, I'm guilty phrase. Sometimes myself, right? I mean,
and I know, Lord, forgive me.
And so the using the lens of like, what does the most good? And let's try to strip the politics and the cultural issues aside. What does the most good based off of the data and the facts? And it's pretty clear.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But also, like, cannabis has a culture of its own. Like, we didn't see it. First of all, you wouldn't know Snoop to be anything else other than a pothead. Let's be for real. Yeah. But, like, it's just the level of influence that we see, especially in our communities. You know, when we were younger, we would go to parties. We would see these things or hear it in the music. But I don't think those are the ultimate things that influence a person to smoke weed. I think it's just an individual experience. You could do it at your own time. I highly recommend to wait till you're 21, as is the legal age here.
Yes.
But definitely what I like what you mentioned about the youth and like keeping the youth away from it, because I think that the cannabis businesses can be a lot more creative in how to draw back some of the youth use. But if we could be more collaborative with cities, towns, even the state on like, how do we create a cannabis youth use deterrence program that really like helps and just see that implemented in schools. Obviously with programs like VIP that we went to, and you know, anything that's sort of like drug intervention and things like that would be dope as a partnership. So.
Yeah, it takes those relationships with young people and someone having that conversation. And I think it becomes easier when something is not sort of demonized in a certain way, because you know how young people's brains work. Once you tell somebody you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, they're going to want to do that, right? Yeah. Instead, similar to liquor, there's a conversation that happens. Look, when you're 21, if you choose to make that decision, that's fine, but your brain is still developing right now. There are things that you have to consider around brain development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. that's a different conversation than just, no, we're not going to talk about it, and then have them find it out on the streets.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to pivot a little bit to current policy because this is like super important. We just actually, you guys, the State House, for the first time in how many thousand years?
Oh my gosh.
It was 100 years.
15 years.
Yeah, something like that. But it was a long time since they have been able to pass a budget through the state ahead of the July 1st deadline, correct?
Correct. Yep.
So that was yesterday, and I'm sure that you're fresh, tired with so many deliberations. Anything from that you want to like talk to, your constituents about? Work that you've done.
So it's a $61 billion budget. This one, the first time, as you said, in 15 years that we get it done before July 1st. We're supposed to have it done by July 1st because that's when the fiscal year starts. And this one felt really different and very challenging, right? Because the federal government is just chaotic right now. It's always chaotic, but even more chaotic right now, right? We don't know what's going to happen with this quote unquote big, beautiful bill that's happening in DC. Before walking in here, I heard that the Senate just passed it.
They just passed it today.
And so it has to go back to the House, and let's see what the House ends up doing. But if that bill passes, like the budget we passed yesterday is going to have to change dramatically. Because it's going to cost us about $15 billion. And we don't have $15 billion as a Commonwealth to make up that money. We have about $8 billion in the rainy day fund. And $15 billion just in Medicaid alone would be taken away from Massachusetts if this big, beautiful bill gets through. And so,
did they just increase the rainy day budget too?
Yeah, I think, it continues to increase year over year. It just continues to increase, which is good. It's a healthy amount in the grand scheme of things. When you think about it, you have more than 10% of your annual budget is in the rainy day fund. But again, it's 10% of your overall budget, right? There's no way we can, fill a federal gap if that comes. And so, but nonetheless, it was $61 billion budget. It was about a 3% increase from the previous year. So trying to keep up with cost of living, inflation, et cetera, on all these different programs. And it's never enough, to be honest with you. Like there's tons of programs that are still underfunded. There's attorneys that represent indigent defendants, for example, that have been fighting for a raise that we weren't able to do in the budget. There's so many things that are still underfunded, but we have to figure out how to make ends meet with the money that we do have and make it go as far as it can, and also not completely draw down on that rainy day fund, because if something goes down in DC, we're really going to have to dip into that.
And it seems like it, even, just having our universities being threatened to being pulled, federal money being pulled in every which way. So, especially I think about the small families, the families that we come from, like, los inmigrantes, todo lo que está pasando con inmigración. Like, I just feel like our communities are under attack. You know what I mean?
100%. One of the things that we were most excited about from the Black and Latino Caucus, a priority of ours in the budget, was the establishment of an immigrant legal defense fund. What we've seen is that people that are detained by ICE, if they get access to an attorney quickly, there's a much higher likelihood that they get out, and particularly nonviolent folks that have been detained. And so we established a $5 million fund in the budget specifically for immigrants that have been detained by ICE and don't have access to an attorney. And so they can access that fund, get an attorney, help represent them, go through their case, hopefully make sure that they can stay here with their families in Massachusetts. And so that was a big deal for us, and I'm glad that got in there.
Yeah, I'm glad it did too, especially because our communities need it. And something I actually just talked about, the crossover between immigration and cannabis, where, you could be a legal permanent resident or an LPR, but if you're in a legal state and you consume weed, or even worse, you decide you want to work in the cannabis industry, by the time that you want to go up for citizenship, the application, they will ask you if you've done any illicit drugs. And technically, this being federally illegal still puts complications for the immigrant community.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if there's any thought to perhaps, highlighting certain things like this, especially because of the sort of the drawback that we're getting from federal support. I mean, I would love to see more of that, but if there's anything with immigrant rights organizations that just seems like it's coming out of thin air because of this administration, how do you guys respond, or you specifically, to your constituents and those groups to be able to provide the best resources? Yeah,
so I mean, the big way to sort of communicate with folks is going to people that have relationships with multiple clusters of immigrants in our community. So for example, in Haverhill, that's through the churches, right? So All Saints Church, for example, we had in the basement of All Saints, we brought the chief of police in, and we had a really good discussion with the MVP parishioners too, and MVP to talk about what Haverhill Police is doing, what they're seeing, what they can and can't do, what they want to do and certainly don't want to do. And that helped build trust in the community. The challenge is that, 2 weeks after we had that, and in that basement setting, we told them, like, look, what we're seeing so far is that they're not going after people who don't pose a threat to public safety. They're not going after, nonviolent individuals. And that was not true, like 3 days later. Right?
Yeah.
And so we have to continue to have these relationships and continue to communicate with people. But the federal government is making it very hard when we're trying to build those relationships and people are skeptical of government.
Yeah.
But it's really important to get this message out, particularly around cannabis, because I think, some people could think, well, no, it's legal here in Massachusetts, so I don't have to worry about that. But at the federal level, it's not. It's very much criminalized and something that could be used against you.
Absolutely.
I just read actually over the weekend, I think there was a kid from Denmark even, so lo está haciendo hasta lo blanquito.
Sí.
They're doing it. He had a picture of something like weed on social media, and they denied his entry to the United States.
They could even deport you.
Yeah, so he had a picture of weed and he had a meme of JD Vance, like the meme of JD Vance, like when he's big, his face is like enlarged, and they used that to like deny his entry to the United States, which is crazy.
That's crazy, especially like, and nowadays with AI, you could even get like any fake photo of like just of yourself smoking a J and not even real. Like, let's say you were to post it online or whatever. Imagine that the impacts to that. So, okay, so especially with regards to the budget and every specific bill that made it out, we saw that the cannabis omnibus bill, right, or I called it the big beautiful cannabis bill.
Right, exactly.
It really felt like that. Were there any provisions in there that were specifically alarming, or anything that you thought may have changed your mind of from what you initially thought about it?
The whole sort of point of the bill was sort of how do we provide some stability to the industry that's been pretty rocky, right? And any new industry is going to be rocky, right? And so this was somewhat expected. And so the whole point of the bill was to provide some clarity on what the CCC should be doing, the Cannabis Control Commission, to respond to the fact that we were hearing from constituents that have licenses saying, hey, we need to be able to get out of this business and we can't get out, to the capital concerns that we hear from these businesses. You can't go get a traditional bank loan because it's not FDIC insured by the federal government, because the federal government doesn't recognize this. And so all of that was sort of the impetus behind doing a cannabis bill to sort of stabilize the industry, make clear the regulations, and ensure that this is an industry that can continue to, flourish in Massachusetts. And also to make it more competitive, particularly for like vertically integrated businesses. Like one of the things on medical marijuana that was important and that I learned a lot about was that if you wanted to get into medical, you needed to have like all these other licenses as well. And so we wanted to make sure that it wasn't as restrictive in that sense, and that people were able to have individual types of licenses as well. The thing that I got really educated on was around the issue of the license caps, right? I think that there's been a lot of reporting on that. Around not wanting to increase the license cap to 6, which is what we did. And I think we ended up in a really good place because even if you have 6 licenses, there's over 350 operators in Massachusetts. That's not going to be a monopoly. Like if you own 6 and there's 344 others, you don't have market control, right? And the benefit of lifting that cap and raising it to 6 at least is that you have more people that can help those owners get out of their business now, right? Because the only people who are buying cannabis businesses now are people who already own cannabis businesses now. It's just the reality of both the industry and where we are economically as a state and a country. And so I think we landed in a really good place. We'll see. The Senate has to go now, so they'll pass their version of the bill. Then we'll go to conference committee, and then it'll go to the governor. Okay,
and that was a nice, quick way of saying how passing a bill works in the state house.
Exactly.
But so ultimately the final step would go to the governor. She would sign off. And then obviously through this bill, there has also been some changes. We'll get back to retail caps in a second. But, this new bill would also allow for the governor to solely appoint 3 commissioners as opposed to the 5 that were appointed through different avenues. And I would imagine that it's just to decrease some of the controversies. Okay.
Because before it was like, the governor gets an appointee, then the treasurer, then the secretary of state. And there were sort of offices that honestly weren't even asking for that authority. They didn't want to get into that. And then the accountability gets murky in that situation, because it's like, so who responds to who's responsible for what? And so it's the governor. It's very clear now that it's the governor, and that all sort of accountability, will run through there.
Yeah, and that would include, of the three, a chair, which the chair could then only solely appoint an executive director.
Yes, yep.
And those are some interesting changes. I actually am in favor of just streamlining something, excuse me. But I know that sometimes there are some commissions, you know, I'll use an example for, like, I don't know, DTA. You know, those type of commissions, that's the Department of Transitional Assistance, where folks get, you know, welfare benefits. There's multiple commissioners, sometimes with different agencies. But for those specific ones, you're not going to have the treasurer appoint somebody to DTA.
No.
Even though you could argue that it makes sense fiscally some way, but that's not the case.
Right.
So I like that idea because it makes it a little bit more synonymous. And then there is other industries, or rather agencies, that are appointed by, like, just the AG and things like that. So I'm assuming you were supportive of those provisions too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it just make anything to sort of streamline this. It just got way too murky when you have multiple people as appointing authorities. You don't know where the buck stops. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's very clear where the buck stops here.
Absolutely. So the point about the retail shops is the license piece. So I was originally opposed to this too. I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but one of the reasons, the key reasons, is because I feel that with regards to social equity applicants and just like the small pool of us that are actually in the industry, there's so many barriers, Andy.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's like an article about HCAs for every like different town that somebody has like confronted something with. But then there's also the aspect of like zoning and things like that. So it seems like, and this is just what I'm gathering from different conversations, that the bill from the social equity advocate perspectives, it seems more like we're not focusing on us, right? And how this could benefit our businesses, because it does speak back to like the competition, but you know, you've already highlighted how it doesn't do that. Yeah. But for someone who's already operating at a different level, you know, little things like that can throw someone off. So how do you barter or even just like converse with other advocates to bring a key point to the table? Yeah.
So, I mean, I think in this particular case, the good news is that if there are ways to strengthen the bill or make them better, the Senate still has to go. So the Senate can figure out some of those components that they can help
before it gets back to you.
Before it comes back to a conference committee. So the way it works is the House, we just passed it. The Senate will go, and then both bills will get into a conference committee. And so the Senate will appoint 3 members from the Senate. The House will appoint 3 members from the House. And then they'll negotiate the differences between the two. And then that final bill will come back around for each chamber with an up or down vote. So we don't get to amend it. We don't get to do anything like that. It's just yes or no. And so there's still an opportunity there. If there are particular components or pieces that maybe could be done better, the Senate could potentially do that.
Yeah, and I think there's hope for that too on the equity side.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I was really interested in was around this piece of the Social Equity Trust Fund. You know, there's a significant amount of money that's in that trust fund. But we could unlock more money from that trust fund if we used it in a way that we use other trust funds. You know, everybody loves grants, right? Grants is the best thing. When you just get a straight up grant, you don't have to worry about paying it back, et cetera. And we should continue to do that. But if we take a piece of the Social Equity Trust Fund and we use it as collateral to open up access to more capital for low interest loans, for example, you could multiply that fund by 10 times, right? And so you could provide access to like low interest loans for cannabis businesses that can't get them anywhere else if we use a piece of that as a revolving loan fund. And so that's one of the things that I'm really interested in, because this is an industry that isn't bankable yet, right? And so we have to figure out how we can provide more access to capital to more people. It's nice to provide, you know, 10 or 20 cannabis businesses with straight up grants, but we could do 150 maybe. And, you know, half of them could be grants and the other half can be, you know, loans at low interest rates that allow them to get out of their bad debt. Because that's the other thing. There's a lot of bad debt out there, you know?
Oh, yeah. And it's a very cash heavy industry.
Exactly.
So finish your point.
No, and that's it. It's just like access to capital is a big piece of this for this industry and any entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs of color. And then you weigh on top of that entrepreneurs of color that are in a industry that is not bankable, that is a recipe for disaster. So we have to make it more accessible for folks.
Absolutely. So I think that overall operators and specifically social equity applicants, not just those who are social equity operators, but like applicants who are trying to get through the process, because there's people who are operating and they got their dispensaries or their delivery, whatever, product manufacturing. Pero there's other ones who are just through the application process, and that's a whole nother ball game. But those folks, the way that they tiered up the social equity fund was like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, depending on what license type you were at, you had access to more money. And I kind of was like, not for nothing, but this is like a little ass backwards in some ways, because that loan model could work, especially for a tier 3 person who already is operating, because you know that they have debt in this space.
Right.
Whereas you just recently did something with entrepreneurs and startup funds, right, for the city of Haverhill. Yeah. Similarly, that should sort of be like where the grants go for tier 1 or tier 2 or whatever.
You don't have cash flow when you're starting out.
Exactly.
Right? But once you get bigger, you start to have cash flow, you start to have debt. And so that's where you can really help people with some access to loans that are really favorable. Yeah.
So hopefully that this conversation might inform some of that policy, but hopefully more conversations overall. Yeah. Thank you. And we're just about to wrap it up, but a couple questions I'll just wrap it up into. So, obviously I know that you've been a strong advocate for civics, myself included.
Yeah.
This is we both are poli-sci graduates. And you've done a lot to get like the youth involved and people just to be a little bit more vocal. So, I find that the cannabis industry is particularly active with operators, right? Again, we talked about that a little bit versus licensees or applicants. So how do you feel like there might be a good way to educate folks in the cannabis industry to get a little bit more involved about civics and the democratic process? Like, what ways can we do that other than just when it comes down to passing bills?
So I think it's all relationships, right? It comes back to like, it's great to hear from the industry when we're taking up a cannabis bill. That's the place where you really want to ramp up advocacy. But throughout the year, there's all sorts of opportunities for people in the industry to weigh in, right? People in the cannabis industry are affected by downtowns, right? So like what kinds of investments are happening in downtowns across Massachusetts? People in the industry are affected by, school meals, right? Like their kids getting free access to school meals or not, right? And so I think, continuing to be an advocate when it's obvious, right, for the cannabis bill that's moving, but having a relationship year round with your legislators on other issues helps so that when it comes time to advocate for your cannabis thing, they see you in a different light. They see you in a light of someone who just cares about their community, cares about their state, and wants to do what's right for their state. And so I think building that relationship over time will pay dividends when it comes time to make the hard asks.
Absolutely. Last question, especially when it comes to sports, because, I'm not a sporty kind of girl, but I saw you with a couple basketball players from the Celtics in the office. So how do you even do things like that where you can do some sort of a creative partnership? Like, I mean, we've seen the NBA talk about how players, often smoke weed and things like that, or that could potentially get them off. Although I think with the league now, that's not a thing. But, I've seen some players, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but former players who now have deals within cannabis and things like that. Do you find that there's ways that we could be creative in using sort of the sports industry to sort of mesh into cannabis or even policy? Like, how do we get people creatively looking at partnerships with our stars, like, the basketball players, like Jalen or whoever, but, how do we get these folks just like meshed up together so that we can amplify the community a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it's finding what people care about, right? I mean, at the end of the day, there's sort of two ways to elevate and get someone with a lot of exposure to take up your issue, right? One is the sort of more straight line, kind of old school way of like paying people for sponsorships, right? The other way, which I think is way more effective, is finding something that someone already cares about, right? So Jalen Brown cares a lot about criminal justice, cares a lot about economic empowerment. And so how do you package your issue in a way that speaks to that athlete or that person who has a platform in a way that aligns with their ideals and values already, right? So you care about empowering Black and brown entrepreneurs. Let me talk to you about this industry and how you can do that right now. So finding ways that, there are values that align with what you're trying to advocate for is probably the best way, even more so than sponsorships.
Absolutely. I would agree. I mean, imagine getting them in the front lines talking about this. This would be super dope. But even better, like getting somebody like Bad Bunny. Oh my gosh. Titi me preguntó, what's your favorite Bad Bunny song?
DJ Adoni, maybe.
But no, did you appreciate any of the new Bad Bunny songs?
Especially that's the best album yet.
I know.
It's the best album yet.
Specifically the one on Hawaii.
Yes, that one was, I wanted to cry hearing that one.
I know.
But also Café con Ron was great. Por la mañana café, por la tarde ron. That was like, wow, this is my song.
Oh, un blong. We'll switch it up.
Voy a llevarte PR also smacks, and then EO also. The way the beat drops in EO, it gets me every time.
I can see you jamming out to that on your way to do these bills.
Before voting.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, Andy. And as always, it's a pleasure to see you, my good friend.
Thank you. Love you.
All right. I love you too. And that's it.